I am Jean du Plessis, Deakin University Law School, and I was really honoured when I was approached to chair the session in honour of the late Bob Baxt and to pay tribute to a great person, a great scholar, a great practitioner, a great colleague and a great friend to many, and a great family man. I became aware of Bob's work when I did research for my LLD thesis, which I completed in 1991 already, and it contains several references to Bob's work. I was thrilled in 1998 when Philip Clarke, the then head of the Deakin Law School, introduced me to Bob at a lunch in Melbourne. It was, however, when Bob approached me in 2014 to become the section editor of the corporate governance section of the Company and Securities Law Journal, when our relationship became much closer. There were times when we had discussions about articles and contributions for the Company and Securities Law Journal almost on a daily basis. Bob invited me to co-present with him at the 2016 Federal Court of Australia's Business Law Conference in Sydney. It was really a wonderful experience for me to work very closely with him on this paper. I discovered that Bob was a very traditional company lawyer. I think he was at times a bit shocked by some of my views, but I was really surprised that even though he sometimes strongly disagreed with me, he allowed some of my more controversial articles and notes to be published in the Companies and Securities Law Journal, making no secret that he did not necessarily agree with me. Just before the Corporate Law Teachers Association's conference last year, Rosemary, Langford and I visited him in hospital. He was as sharp as ever, and we have spent a golden hour with him and his wife Ruth. He passed away a short time later. I want to conclude this introduction session to this session at the Corporate Law Teachers Association, and I visited him, I want to conclude it by handing over to Rosemary Langford also to say a few words. Rosemary had a close professional and friendship relationship with Bob over many years and also worked closely with Bob as editor of the Directors' Duty section of the Company and Securities Law Journal. Rosemary Langford.
Thanks, Jean. Jean's asked me to talk about Bob's career, and I've got a few personal comments as well. So there's no doubt that Robert Baxt AO, Bob as we knew him, had a distinguished career. So I have to read a little bit because there's so much. He was Dean of the Faculty of Law at Monash University. He was Chair of the Trade Practices Commission. He was partner at what was Arthur Robinson and Hedowicks, which became Allen's Linklaters. He was an emeritus partner at Herbert Smith Freehills. He was the chair of the Business Law section of the Law Council of Australia. He was chair of the Law Committee of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He was general editor of the Company and Securities Law Journal and the Australian Business Law Review, and also founding editor. As you would know, he won a number of accolades and awards throughout his career, and they included an Order of Australia for services to the law, and I was a little bit interested to look at that. Included trade practices, competition, taxation, corporate law and legal education. Also a Centenary Medal and the Queen's Birthday Honours Award in 2003. As if that wasn't enough, he was also awarded the first ever honorary life membership by the Law Council of Australia, the Business Law section. And just before he passed away, he was awarded an honorary LLD by Monash University, and I found out that's Monash University's highest honour. I'm sure there's more that Bob achieved. In terms of my own institution, Melbourne Law School, since 2011 we've held the annual Baxt Lecture in Competition Law. It attracts a large number of people and apparently is a highlight on the Australian competition law calendar and will continue to be. Bob's great legacies were celebrated, and it was actually intended he would be there, but unfortunately he passed away before the conference was held. But in June last year, Melbourne Law School held a a conference entitled Contemporary Issues in Corporate and Competition Law, a conference in honour of Professor Robert Baxt AO. That was actually organised by the Honourable Justice Ashley Black and Professor Pamela Hanrahan. Featured a lineup of judges, regulators, academics and practitioners. And there's publication resulting from that that's actually already been published. So that's a sort of bare bones outline of Bob's, some of his achievements, but we all know that he was highly enthusiastic and committed to the positions he held. In his role as professorial fellow at Melbourne Law School, he was very instrumental in building the competition law and economics network. He was also extremely central in the Corporations Committee of the Business Law section of the Law Council of Australia, of which I'm a member too. In 2017, the Business Law section offered for the first time the Baxt Law Prize. As we all know, Bob was a prodigious author. So as editor of the CSLJ and ABLR, he wrote numerous editorials. He made an enormous contribution to those journals. He poured in huge amounts of time and effort. He also wrote 2 columns of the Australian Law Journal and was consulting editor of the Journal of Banking and Finance Law and Practice. He wrote numerous textbooks or books, and I've been interested to know that he wrote 21 editions of the AICD publication Duties and Responsibilities of Directors and Officers. His style was forthright, he said what he thought, and his comments on developments and proposals were timely and astute. He was passionate about the law and the latest developments, and who can forget him tapping away on his BlackBerry in conferences and meetings. One of the things I valued, and lots of people have valued, is that Bob always took care to encourage younger authors and students. He always had time for people. At his funeral it was said Bob was a people person, and he was. He was always keen to hear from me about students who might be interested in doing work with him, and he was happy to publish work no matter how junior the author. So 25 years ago, I was one of those students and then academics. I was doing what was then called a summer clerkship at Arthur Robinson and Hedowitz, and he published, in 1994, he published my equity essay in the Company and Securities Law Journal. 2 years later, he published a revised version of a research essay that I'd written. That was actually the start of my academic career, although I had no idea at the time. The citations to those articles were very important to me when I re-entered academia later. Bob always said what he thought without fear or favour. You were never left wondering what he thought or what was going through his mind, but he was also a big softie. Once he had confidence in you, he was tremendously loyal. He told me shortly before he passed away that he felt fortunate for the life that he'd led. Many of us feel fortunate to have known Bob and to have had the benefit of his support for so many years. So in conclusion, Bob was a scholar, a teacher, an author, a regulator, an advisor and a practitioner. He was also a great friend, a devoted husband, father and grandfather. His wife Ruth was constantly at his side, and I'd like to pay tribute to the enormous support she was to Bob. Bob's friendliness, forthrightness, intellect and humour will be greatly missed by so many people. I'm privileged to have known Bob and to have had his unwavering support for so long, and I do send my condolences to Ruth, Simone and Miriam, who continue to miss him keenly.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. I've asked Peter Butler, partner Herbert Smith and Freehills, to say something about Bob as practitioner. Peter Butler and Bob knew each other for a very long time. He was one of Bob's students. He was the head of litigation at Freehills and later managing partner, recruiting Bob, and later on also worked very closely with him in a professional capacity, and there's been a long-standing friendship relationship between Peter and Bob. Peter Butler.
I've been asked to say a few words about our friend, and a person we all admire so much, Bob Baxt, and I'm delighted to do so. I wish I was there with you to watch everything that's said about Bob, but I'm glad you're honouring him as you are by this session. My own history goes back with Bob a very long time. I remember him when I was a student and he was the dean. He was the Dyer of academics. I remember him very well when I was an article clerk, and he supervised some of my little projects, little things that I wrote, little research pieces. And then we sort of stayed in touch. I guess the time when I got to know him best was when, after a very long stint in the law and doing some other things that you're well aware of, particularly in the competition law field, he decided it was time to move from my old law firm Allen's, to Freehills, and he moved across and became a partner in 2005. I was at that stage either head of the litigation group or managing partner, I can't remember. But when I heard that he'd come on the market, as it were, we literally embraced him. Bob is a powerhouse in so many ways. I'm not telling those listening to this anything you don't already know when I say this, but he is a doyen of corporate law, of competition law, of academic law, of teaching law, and to have the opportunity to bring him in with all the energy and passion he had for the work that he was doing as a corporate lawyer and a competition law lawyer was a dream come true for us here at Freehills. And so we embraced him, and he and I got to know each other well socially for some time. He stayed in that role, I think, until 2011, particularly focusing on competition law. He worked very closely with his friends at NAB, and then he became a consultant, and then he became something that we've never had before, or I think since, which is, I'm pretty sure his suggestion, an emeritus partner of Freehills. We loved having him. He brought so much with him. He inspired so many lawyers, partners like me, and young lawyers. He helped develop our practice. He gave us that little bit of extra that we needed to make a real go of it in areas that we were keen to develop. And it was a pleasure getting to know him and his wife, Ruth, and working with him as we did. Again, I'm delighted you're celebrating his achievements with this session. He deserves it. He's much missed, and I'm just glad that for a long time, my path crossed with his. Thanks very much, and enjoy the session.
Thanks to Peter. I have asked Ian Ramsay to say a few words about Bob's academic contribution and some of his publications and his editorial work as a scholar. Ian has had a long-standing academic, professional and friendship relationship with Bob, and he also served on the editorial board of the Companies and Securities Law Journal. Ian Ramsay.
Thank you, Jean. Well, it's not possible to do justice to Bob's many scholarly contributions in the time available this afternoon. But for those of you who would like to read a detailed review of Bob's publications, I can recommend very highly the chapter by Justice Ashley Black in the book that he co-edited with Pamela Hanrahan, titled Contemporary Issues in Corporate and Competition Law, Essays in Honour of Professor Robert Baxt, published in December last year. Bob was an extraordinary supporter of academics, even though being an academic was only one part of his career. He was also very active in educating legal practitioners and company directors. Many of his publications were in fact directed at company directors to help them understand their obligations. His educational roles were not limited to his academic teaching, but extended to the many conferences and workshops that he organised. Bob published many books, journal articles and book chapters. Some of his best known books would include Cases and Materials on Corporations and Associations, first co-authored with Alan Afterman, later Saul Fridman, first edition 1972. The Ray Report, Quo Vadis, published in 1975, a detailed look at that very famous report, the Ray Report, that led to many important reforms of our securities regulation. Rosemary mentioned Duties and Responsibilities of Directors and Officers, 21 editions published through the Institute of Company Directors, showing Bob's long-standing commitment to the education of company directors. And if I had to mention one other book, let me briefly mention An Introduction to the Securities Industry Acts, co-authored with Harold Ford and Graham Samuel, first edition 1977. But it's one of Bob's books that has continued to date. The 9th edition was published in 2017 with the title Securities and Financial Services Law. Co-authors, in addition to Bob, were Ashley Black and Pamela Hanrahan. Bob's publications reflected extraordinary breadth, and in fact the topics he wrote about included directors' duties, shareholders' rights and remedies, insolvency, auditors' liability, financial services law, competition law and taxation law. But one interest of Bob's was directors' duties. He wrote regularly on the topic, and he had a particular interest in the duty of care. He contributed 2 chapters to books that I edited, and both of those chapters dealt with the duty of care. In the first of those chapters, published in 1997, Bob identified and discussed a series of cases in which courts had imposed a higher standard of care on company directors. He especially focused on the judgments in the AWA litigation. And Bob concluded his chapter by observing that a specific statutory provision recognising the authority of directors to delegate would potentially assist directors. And as we know, such a provision was subsequently introduced into the Australian Corporations Act. It was in the second of the chapters, which was a book published in honour of Professor Harold Ford, that Bob paid particular attention to the statutory business judgment rule, as well as more recent cases at that time dealing with the duty of care. It's relevant to note that in that book, which was published in 2002, Bob wrote that the duty of care has become, quote, the hottest topic among lawyers, business people, governments and various professionals, as well as the public. And I suggest that observation, focusing upon the duty of care, is as true today as it was when Bob wrote that 17 years ago. Some of Bob's journal articles continue to be widely cited, even though they were in fact published many years ago. One example is his journal article on what is now Section 1324 of the Australian Corporations Act, previously Section 574, the section that deals with injunctions. His article, with the rather catchy title, Will Section 574 of the Companies Code Please Stand Up?, was published in 1989 in the Company and Securities Law Journal. Without doing a thorough search, I'd have to say, in my view, it would be the most cited article on Section 1324. Given the extent of Bob's publications, today let me just touch on a few themes in his publications. Some of the themes are reflected in Bob's opening address to the 1992 Corporate Law Teachers' Conference. His speech was later published in the Australian Journal of Corporate Law. The issues Bob addressed at that conference included the failings of regulators to properly enforce the law. He also commented on the style of drafting in the Australian corporations legislation, highly technical, extraordinarily complex, creating problems for courts, practitioners, academics, and anyone who has to deal with the law. Bob also commented at that time that in his view penalties for contraventions of the law were much too low. Now, not all would agree with Bob's views, and as Rosemary said, when Bob expressed a view, he expressed it forcefully. For example, at that time, he questioned the need for the continuous disclosure laws, stating, and I quote, just how useful some of this information is, or who might wish to use it, is doubtful, and the burdens that are imposed add considerable costs which are passed on to the consumer. But when Bob expressed his views forcefully, not for 1 second did he think that everyone listening to his speech would agree with him. Bob gave that speech 27 years ago, and the themes he commented on continue to be relevant, as we see, for example, in the hearings of the Royal Commission into Misconduct in the Banking, Superannuation and Financial Services Industry. Bob concluded that speech with 8 recommended changes, and I quote, what Bob stated, he said, what is needed today if we are to ensure that the same kind of problems that have occurred previously do not occur are as follows. And he gave 8 points. 8 recommendations. Number 1, a properly funded Securities Commission. Number 2, a stock exchange which has the power to act properly in relation to areas which it currently seems to have inadequate powers. 3, guidelines to judges to ensure that they interpret the law according to the spirit of the law. 4, a more interested and informed press which helps highlight areas that need to be addressed. 5, a cheaper and swifter system of justice to enable shareholders to seek appropriate remedies. 6, a balanced and informed academic community which debates the important issues. 7, a vigorous and constructive system of continuous education which will lead to a more informed and responsive profession and business community. And 8, a positive endorsement of the idea of an exchange of ideas between the profession, government and academia. Again, I suggest we continue to see how those recommendations of Bob's continue to be relevant today. Another theme that runs through much of Bob's writings is his extraordinarily strong interest in law reform. He was, as we know, a very active contributor to law reform debates, and he was always willing to put forward his views in journal articles, books, many submissions, and also through the many seminars and conferences he organised. Some issues he viewed as of such significance that he wrote multiple times on the topic. For example, his sceptical view of the use of infringement notices by regulators. I mentioned in my opening comments that Bob supported academics. One way he did this was through his editorship of journals. Consider how many academics have published in journals that Bob edited. Not just academics based in Australia, but I suggest also academics based in New Zealand. In my view, there is no one who has played a more pivotal editorial role in the corporate and commercial law areas in Australia than Bob Baxt. Bob was the founding editor of the Australian Business Law Review. The first issue of the journal was published in 1973, and in that editorial Bob wrote, "With the increasing amount of legislative activity in the general area of business, the interdependence of the legal and business communities, a forum is necessary for these sectors of community to express ideas about the adequacy or necessity of legislation and the way in which courts react to the various moves by Parliament. It is hoped in the pages of this new journal to provide such a forum. The exchange of ideas, the arguments that will ensure, will no doubt provide a valuable background for clearer and more intelligent understanding of the business laws of this country." We see here a clear theme of Bob's work, the importance of interaction between government, practitioners, academics and regulators to ensure a better understanding of the law. Bob was also the founding editor of the Company and Securities Law Journal, the first issue of which was published in 1982. And in his very first editorial in that year, Bob wrote, "One thing is very clear, the need for a journal to publish important critiques and evaluations of the new National Company Scheme, the legislative package which makes up the scheme, the operations of the Securities Commission, and the evaluation of decisions both of the common law and of Parliament. It is apparent that the whole area of company and securities law is of vital importance to a large section of the business and professional communities. The scope for articles, commentaries, notes and general information about the new company scheme is large. I hope this journal will assist in achieving these objectives." In the first editorial, Bob provided his views on the new National Company Scheme, and he wrote, interestingly, "It's my firm view that the National Companies and Securities Scheme, which has now been in place for 14 months, will be replaced by a national scheme controlled by the government in Canberra," and he was certainly right. The national scheme that he wrote about was replaced, as we know. Bob's last editorials for the Australian Business Law Review and the Company and Securities Law Journal were published early last year. In his final editorial for the Company and Securities Law Journal, Bob wrote about the challenges confronting ASIC, the work of the Royal Commission, and he also wrote that he planned to write about the work of the Royal Commission in future editorials, and he concluded by saying, "I look forward to what can only be described as a very interesting 12 months in the area of corporate law." Unfortunately, that was not to be, but it showed Bob's optimism. Even when he was very ill, he was always looking forward to the next corporate law development. Bob edited the Australian Business Law Review for 45 years and the Company and Securities Law Journal for 36 years. I understand that Bob wrote these final editorials while he was in hospital in the final stages of his life. Bob loved the law and he loved discussing it with us. I'm really very grateful for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts regarding someone who made so many important contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. We have asked Bruce Dyer to say something about Bob as regulator and Bob's significant contribution in several areas of commercial law and corporate law. Bruce knew Bob as a student in the early 1980s. When he was a student of Bob, he also later on tutored for Bob. From 2000, Bob and Bruce worked for competing firms and had regular contact also through the Corporations Committee of Business Law section of the Law Council of Australia, corporations workshops and other conferences and events that they both attended. So a short video from Bruce Dyer.
In saying a few words about Bob Baxt's contribution to company law and regulators in particular, I'm going to focus on takeovers regulation because that's the area that I know. It has to be said, however, that's a relatively minor interest for Bob. When you think about all his work in relation to securities regulation, securities industry generally, directors' duties, and outside company law, of course, competition law, tax, and so on. It really is a very small part. Despite that, Bob did publish extensively in relation to takeovers issues, and in a quick hunt around the takeovers panel offices, I found at least 3 editions of just one of his works. In addition to that, there was, of course, his case books, his editorials in particular in journals where he would comment on current developments and bring them to the attention of busy practitioners who might not otherwise have the time to look at those developments. Bob's work in relation to journals is very significant. If you take away the CSLJ, the ABLR, you take away a huge number of journal articles in the area of takeovers, the vast majority relevant to Australian practice, I would think. But that publication side was just one aspect of Bob's contribution, and comparatively a relatively minor one, I think, because I think that the amazing thing about Bob's contribution in this area was what he facilitated, and he did that through the conferences that he organised, and in the area of takeovers, he was organising conferences back in the 80s, possibly the 70s before that, I'm not sure. And those conferences were important in bringing together a range of practitioners, judges, barristers, and academics. And I think that's one of the really powerful contributions of Bob, the way he was able to bring together different parts of the profession and also academics to make a combined contribution. And when you think about all that he facilitated, really, through the means of the committees he established, the Law Council committees, all the law reform submissions that he facilitated through that, all the journal articles he encouraged, he edited, he facilitated through his journals, and all the practitioners, all the regulators that he mentored and encouraged. It really is a remarkable combination. I think one that's immeasurable, really, and impossible to know the real extent of it all.
Thank you, Bruce. The next person who will say a few words is Jason Harris. I've asked Jason just to talk about working with Bob and some of his contributions to Australian corporate law. Jason He's had a long-standing academic, professional, and friendship relationship with Bob, and annotated Thomson Reuters' corporations legislation with Bob as the overseeing editor. Jason.
Thanks very much for inviting me to talk about my colleague and friend Bob Baxt. I worked with Bob in a number of different capacities over a number of years, starting in 2003. We worked on the Annotated Corporations Act, as Jean said, and Bob and I worked together over 6 years and produced 9 editions of that work. Bob wrote the annual review each year, and one of the things that I was always amazed at was how he was able to just draw together so many different areas of corporate law developments each year and to express some thoughtful views in a very concise way each year in the annual review. And I'm sure that readers, both practitioners and academics and students alike, found that very helpful and valuable. I also spent a bit of time with Bob discussing whether to do a new edition of the Afterman and Baxt casebook, and it was interesting once I became involved in that project with the publisher, how much I heard from academics about how much they valued that work and how much they wanted it updated, and unfortunately Bob's illness meant that we didn't continue with that project. I also worked with Bob quite closely through my work on the Law Council of Australia, and we sat on several subcommittees that worked on submissions dealing with directors' duties and penalties, business judgment rule issues, liability issues, and also the role of ASIC and sanctions in corporate law. And I was always amazed really at the sort of people who sit on the Law Council of Australia, some of the leading practitioners in corporate law. And Bob was always able to cut through, basically. That was one of the things that really impressed me about working with him. And we could be talking about all sorts of different topics, often very complex issues, and he was able to really cut through to the core of those issues and express very plainly and very forcefully what some of the practical consequences were that we were discussing. And it was so impressive that he was able to do that across multiple areas of law with equal force and knowledge. So not only corporate law, we've also heard about competition law, trust law, of course. He co-authored one of the leading works on discretionary trusts, and tax law. And one of the features I found of working with Bob and dealing with Bob was that his approach was often to strive for something better, to challenge the status quo, to refuse to accept that the state of corporate regulation was all we could hope for. And that was something that was tremendously rewarding working with him, because he was always thinking critically about how we could and should do better. And he expressed those views in a broad variety of fora. Just looking at his publications in terms of the contribution to, or some of the contributions to corporate law, certainly through his editorials in a number of journals, but also through the Baxt report, which had been going, I think, perhaps for 10 years now, through the many articles that he wrote aside from editorials, and of course through his submissions work. And it was interesting just preparing for this talk and reflecting on his contribution and the scope and depth of his contribution. So, for example, I found more than 30 cases in the Australian Corporations and Securities reports that cited his work. I found more than 500 articles on OSLI which refer to his work. He's listed as the author, this would include all of his editorials, in the Aegis Citation Index of more than 500 articles dating back to 1974, which is astounding. And even just in the Australian Law Journal, he's referred to almost 300 times. So to try and measure the effect of Bob's contribution just on corporate law, let alone the other areas, as an earlier speaker said, is immeasurable, because he touched almost every aspect of corporate law, and for that we're all thankful.
Thank you very much, Jason. We have asked Philip Clarke to say something about Bob as Dean of the Monash Law School, and he was recruited by Bob and worked very closely with Bob when he was the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Monash University. So Philip Clarke.
Bob Baxt was the Dean of the Monash Law Faculty between 1980 and 1988. During that time, I came to know him very well, professionally and personally. He became, I'm proud to say, one of my mentors, a role from which I have benefited considerably for much of the rest of my professional career. Bob was an outstanding Dean. He was indefatigably energetic, innovative in his approach to legal education, and highly supportive of his colleagues. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear that in many respects he was ahead of his time. In particular, in his anticipation of the importance of international reputation on institutional rankings, something which, as you know, we've become obsessed with in recent times, and in his emphasis on working collaboratively with the profession in order to pursue research and to secure financial support for the faculty. There are many examples of this, but three come to mind. First, building strong international relationships to rapidly build Monash's reputation. Bob recognised that as a relatively young faculty, Monash could only hope to compete with the more established law faculties and thereby advance the interests of students and staff by making itself well known and well regarded by other institutions in Australia and especially overseas. This he achieved through promotional visits in person, his energy and enthusiasm here were critical, and through developing exchange programs that funded visits to Monash by distinguished international figures and by secondments to overseas institutions by Monash staff, and of course by supporting student participation in domestic and international competitions. Such things, of course, these days are commonplace, but in Bob's time they were not, and he pioneered their development. Secondly, by establishing the Centre for Commercial Law and Applied Legal Research. Bob established the centre to promote research and teaching collaboration with law firms and with other bodies in Australia and New Zealand, and to help secure their financial support. Again, recognising the challenges associated with not being a well-established law faculty that could expect beneficence for its own sake, he reasoned that for Monash to secure cooperation and largesse, it needed to provide potential benefactors with something in return for their involvement. Principally, this took the form of granting them access to exclusive workshops and seminars, such as the legendary Trade Practices Workshop, which continues to this day, and the company law workshops, which he pioneered. As an aside, as you're meeting at the wonderful Auckland Law School, for which I have enormous empathy, I note that Dr. Mark Berry, the current chairman of the New Zealand Commerce Commission, was an active participant in the trade practices workshops held by the Monash Centre in Australia and in New Zealand. Third, Bob worked assiduously to promote research and publication, both for their own sake, but also with an eye to promoting Monash itself. He did this by establishing the Australian Business Law Review, now in its 47th year, the Company and Securities Law Journal, and the Annual Survey of Australian Law. And as you all know, as yet another testament to his indefatigability, he remained the active general editor of the ABLR and the CSLJ until his death early last year. In my experience, Bob was always supportive of his colleagues, especially the more junior ones, as I was at the time I spent at Monash. He took a personal interest in their careers, as well as a respectful interest in their personal lives. He went out of his way to introduce them and promote them to senior and influential figures outside the law school, and was always supportive of their dreams where possible. Bob's irrepressible promotion of the Monash Law faculty and his professional enthusiasm were infectious and inspirational. They made him one of the outstanding law deans of his generation. On a more personal level, he was a wonderful friend to many of us, and he is greatly missed.
Thank you, Philip. We have got two more short video clips, one from Rebecca Maslen Stannage. She's the Deputy Senior Partner, Herbert Smith and Freehills, also the Chair of the Business Law Section of the Law Council of Australia, which Bob was instrumental in creating. She also had a long-standing professional and friendship relationship with Bob. I have asked her just to talk about Bob as Emeritus Partner at Herbert Smith and Freehills. Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Maslen Stannage, Deputy Senior Partner of Herbert Smith Freehills and Chair of the Business Law Section of the Law Council of Australia. I'm really delighted to be able to pay tribute to our great reformist lawyer and friend, Professor Bob Baxt. Bob was actually instrumental in forming the Business Law Section of the Law Council, which I now chair. His contribution to the Law Council, the broader legal community and to law reform has been enormous. So I understand quite a lot of effort went on in Bob's part and with a few others, seeing the need for a body to advocate for good business laws in Australia. As you know, Bob was a passionate defender of the rule of law and fairness in procedure, in penalties. The breadth and depth of his legal knowledge and policy contribution were just incredible. He's chaired the Law Committee of the AICD, the Company and Securities Law Journal and the Australian Business Law Review. He was the founder and general editor of that. And in the Business Law section, he not only was a past chair himself, he was a long-serving executive member, chair of the Competition Committee, and basic general enthusiast and contributor over many, many workshops, seminars, and other thought leadership pieces over many, many years. And we were delighted that in so much of his work for the Business Law section, he had his lovely wife, Ruth, by his side. Ruth got dragged along, not completely unwillingly, to corporations and competition workshops, and in fact herself was a contributor. And we're delighted that Ruth actually continues to be involved in our Business Law section activities. But a great thing about Bob, and there were so many of them, even though he was super intelligent and able to hobnob with academics at a global level and judges, he was able to distill legal concepts in a way that made them accessible and that everyone could understand. And he was not only comfortable, he thrived on engaging with junior lawyers and contributing to their development. He spent years as a Dean of Law at Monash University, many years in academia generally, and of course, many years at our firm, Herbert Smith Freehills, as well as Allen's before that. Bob supported and mentored so many people, and it really struck me when I was at his funeral. I looked around, and among the many people he had mentored were several women, and it struck me, gosh, I'm actually one of Bob's mentees, because he was always supportive and looking out for opportunities for me to develop my career, as well as things I was very interested in, for which I was very, very grateful. And again, he had the absolute same skill with junior lawyers and paralegals, always being ready to tell me who the great latest discovery was that he was working with and how well they were doing. When Bob fell ill and insisted on doing things like conferencing into the corporation's workshop from hospital, we were saying, Bob, please give yourself a break. We were really worried that he was pushing himself so hard despite being unwell. But what we realised was it was just part of Bob's lifeblood to contribute, to try and make the law the best law that we could have and to get the right outcome. And in fact, he loved it. He contributed right to the end. He loved every minute of it, and it was part of what we loved about Bob, that he was so passionate about pursuing those noble causes. The Law Council, the Business Law section, and the legal profession generally will simply not be the same without Bob. We really miss him and couldn't be more grateful for his contribution over the years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Just to show how much respect people have for Bob, Rod Levy, who is a corporate partner at Herbert Smith and Freehills, only sent his contribution 2 hours ago, and so we are fortunate that we can play this to you as well. He knew Bob for many years prior to Bob's joining the firm and worked closely with him as a partner. Rod.
Hi, I'm Rod Levy. I'm a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills in Melbourne, and I had the privilege of working with Bob as a partner for many years. In fact, I knew him before that in other roles he had, and I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about my recollections and his time at HSF. Bob, of course, joined us as a very young lawyer originally. He worked in Sydney in the 1960s before he was an academic, but he then became an academic, as you know, and went on to his role with the Trade Practices Commission. He joined another firm, but when he reached the age of 65, under that firm's policy, he was required to retire. He then joined us, and we were very happy to get him, and we saw him as having a lot of ability, intelligence, and energy, which we thought would be great for us, and that proved to be the case, of course. Bob worked with us as a partner for a long time. He had a role acting for many of the leading clients of the firm and led them through major transactions concerning competition law issues. The other thing that Bob did whilst he was he continued his legal writing. In fact, I think Bob would be the most prolific writer of legal subjects in Australia, in Australian history, in fact. Perhaps the world, I'm not sure, but his output was phenomenal. And not only did he write on a wide variety of topics and produce a huge output, I was incredibly impressed by the amount of insight and understanding that he brought to everything he wrote, and it was really, 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 really impressive. And I'm sure everyone listening to this would recognise what I'm saying. The other thing about Bob is that he was very popular here. He's very popular with all the staff, and particularly with young lawyers. Lots of young lawyers want to go and work with him and learn from him, and he took a great deal of care working with them and teaching them about competition law and corporate law as well. He was also a fixture at the firm's social functions. He was very popular on the dance floor, believe it or not. And he was always on the dance floor at the firm's Christmas party, and that's one of the happy memories people here have of Bob. So anyway, that's a short insight of my recollections about Bob. I hope you've enjoyed that. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod. I would like to invite anybody from the audience who would like to pay tribute to Bob to just come forward if you want and say a few words so that could also be recorded. John Farrar. Thanks, John.
Well, I'm very pleased to speak in memory of my friend Bob. I knew Bob for about 40 years, and I knew him very well as a fellow dean. He was dean of Monash, I was dean of the University of Canterbury. Bob was a very effective dean at Monash. One of the things he did was to set up a centre for commercial law. Bob was an expert at flushing money out of law firms to fund this kind of activity, which was an activity of lawyers, judges and academics of a most convivial and constructive kind. And for a number of years, these were very effective forums and conferences. Bob was an outstanding chair of the legal committee of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. He was prominent in the Law Council of Australia. He was a born networker, really. I think he was involved in advising about the setting up of the Bond Law School. I think he may even have been approached to be the dean, but he had more common sense than I did, and I ended up at some stage as the dean at Bond. Bob just had so much energy and drive, and it manifested itself in so many different ways. And overall, like Lord Denning, he was not a very retiring person. And I still feel the spirit of Bob is with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Anybody else that would like to say? Jennifer Hill. Thank you, Jennifer.
Well, just a couple of very brief comments. I, like so many people in this room, really benefited from Bob. We didn't realise he was a mentor, but somehow he could draw things out of all of us and make us see possibilities that we couldn't see ourselves. And right from the very beginning, when I met Bob, he made it possible, as Rosemary was saying, that, you know, gee, maybe I can be an academic, maybe I can do these things in life, because he knew that you could, and he encouraged people to do that. And so for the many decades that I knew Bob, I was just so appreciative of that support and that creativity, that he could see things in people that they yet hadn't discovered in themselves. The other things that I remember at so many of the business law conferences is bumping into Bob and Ruth early morning, out walking together, up at the crack of dawn, just enjoying each other's company before a long day, with us boring corporate lawyers. And I just thought that is one absolutely marvellous marriage and relationship. And so just on the personal and the professional level, Bob was fabulous.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. What can I say if you listen to all the tributes? What a remarkable man, Bob Baxt. Supported by a remarkable woman, Ruth. And I'm so glad that Jennifer also mentioned that special relationship. I only met her once in person, but I could feel the very, very special relationship and bond between them. He will be missed dearly by many of us, and I know by his family as well. I trust the session really honoured him in an appropriate way, and I thank you all for your participation. Thank you.